I am joined by Carla Freeman, the Library of Congress's chair in U.S. China relations and director of the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. Also, we have Hal Brands, who's the incoming Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Kluge Center. Hal is Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins, and he's also a senior scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to you both. Let me start with a question for Carla, and then it will be the same question to kind of give the overview of how we're thinking about public diplomacy in the wake of COVID. Where are U.S.-China relations going?
Well, I don't think they're headed in a very good direction. We started the year with some promising signs in the relationship. I mean, we had concluded an interim trade agreement, and it looked like we were putting the trade war on hiatus and we could move forward in the relationship. But the coronavirus has certainly sent that potential positive movement in the relationship in a tailspin and highlighted some of the problems in the relationship that have been ongoing, and now I think has pushed them increasingly to the forefront of the dynamic between the two countries. We really are facing a China that is far more publicly hostile to the United States, has used the coronavirus as a public relations opportunity to push its message out about China's superior system, and has also sent a strong message that is designed to communicate that the United States is a failing country, and highlighting most recently the social the unrest, the marches against police brutality in the United States as a feature or a sign of U.S. problems. So we're going to come out of this having a much harder time finding toeholds, but with China to work on issues together. You know, I'm a eternal optimist. So when we first faced this crisis, I thought that the coronavirus as a global challenge, where we all need to work together, would provide an opportunity for the two countries to come together. And the moment just isn't right. I think there's just so much mistrust on the two sides, and we are going to come out of this with all of the same geostrategic challenges that we faced before the coronavirus, but with many economic burdens to address, and on both sides. And I think for what this means for China, and you can see it already playing out in the high altitudes on the China-India border, is a China that is going to be much more defensive and focused, because on asserting its sovereignty, its interests overseas, because it faces so many challenges internally, and Xi Jinping has to be perfect. And when the Chinese government doesn't perform well under his leadership, then there are problems. And so I think we're going to see what you might describe as diversionary efforts by China overseas, and all of that will just bode ill for the U.S.-China relationship.
Where do you think things are going in the wake of the pandemic, Hal?
So I think Carla has it basically right, unfortunately, which is that, even in the run up to the pandemic, I think the assessment of a lot of people who watched the relationship closely was that whatever trade deal, whatever phase one trade deal we got, was really going to be more of a truce rather than a lasting resolution of the issues dividing the two countries. And it had become increasingly common to talk about a new Cold War between the United States and China. And you can like that analogy, you cannot like that analogy, but what it captured was that there was an increasing sense, certainly in the United States, and as I understand it, in certain Chinese decision-making circles as well, that the relationship was headed for deepening competition, that the competition was simultaneously strategic, economic, and ideological in nature, in the way that Carla pointed out, in the sense that the competition involved questions of whether authoritarian or democratic systems were better suited for success in the 21st century. And so the response to coronavirus was viewed through that lens. It was viewed, I think, in a zero sum rather than a positive sum lens in both capitals. And so the initial response in Washington was, hey, great, this is going to accelerate US China economic decoupling. Firms are going to come home from China. This is a big problem for China, maybe not a big problem for the world. That obviously was a misjudgment. But as the crisis deepened, you saw a virtual absence of US China cooperation or even high level dialogue at certain points. And so the crisis has had the effect of sharpening all of the perceptions of danger and competition that were already moving the relationship in a fairly challenging direction. And so if you look at the public polling and how Americans view China, coronavirus has accomplished something that a decade plus of assertive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea couldn't. It's convinced a majority of Americans that US policy toward China should be either tougher than it is now or as tough as it is now, and that the Chinese Communist Party represents a significant challenge to their prosperity and well-being. I'm sure there are similar dynamics at work in Beijing. And so, Ronald Reagan, when he was talking to Soviet leaders back in the 1980s, used to kind of bemuse everybody by saying, well, if aliens came down from outer space, the United States and the Soviet Union would resolve their differences very quickly and cooperate on the common threat. We've had kind of the closest approximation of that happening in terms of this exogenous shock to the system over the past few months. But it's actually pushed the two countries farther apart by highlighting all the things they don't like about each other.
And you brought up that Cold War analogy, which you hear people talk about on Capitol Hill and other places, the commentary on that. Where does that analogy fall short?
So it falls short in a lot of places. And I think that it's important to clarify that, people who use the new Cold War analogy usually aren't saying that the US-China competition is exactly the same or nearly the same as the US-Soviet competition, because there are so many obvious differences. The level of economic integration between the United States and China is orders of magnitude greater than it was for the US and the Soviet Union. The levels of interconnectedness between American allies and China are greater still. And there are a variety of other ways in which the Chinese regime is different than the Soviet regime, in which the geography of the competition is different, and so on and so forth. I think the best argument you can make in favor of the Cold War analogy is basically twofold. That there are challenges the United States faced during the Cold War that it will face in a long-term competition with China. These challenges might be maintaining a diverse and fractious coalition over many years. It might be using a competition as an opportunity to improve the functioning of one's system and one's polity at home. Those sorts of broad challenges applied during the Cold War, and I think to some extent they apply today. The other good defense of the Cold War analogy, I think, is that the Cold War is simply the only time in America's history where the United States has geared up over a period of decades for explicit self-conscious competition with an authoritarian power. And so we are going to, consciously or unconsciously, be pillaging the Cold War's history for lessons in dealing with China. And so perhaps we ought to do it more formally and systematically rather than less formally and systematically.
Carla, Hal brought up the question of whether autocratic or authoritarian regimes handle crises better than democracies. Do you have a perspective on that?
Well, I think if you compare the U.S. and Chinese responses, you probably come out giving the Chinese higher marks for being able to manage and control the disease. But it continues to flare up in China, of course, and it's not over there yet. We're not sure exactly what how the story will end, but China has spent much of the last decade rebuilding its health care system, and has a better ability to deliver treatment to large numbers of people, partly because it can throw up buildings quickly and order people to move from different regions and so forth, and all of those things that authoritarian systems can do. But of course, the disease never would have progressed as rapidly as it did, and possibly would not have become the pandemic that it has become had China had a more open and transparent political system. And this is a lesson that Hu Jintao, during the SARS epidemic of 2002, 2003, learned was that when it's not unusual for local governments to suppress information. I mean, one of my colleagues has likened the situation to sort of the Jaws movie, where the local mayor didn't want to let anybody know that there was a man-eating shark because he wanted to keep the beaches open. So it's not that alone is not a feature of an authoritarian system. But the problem in China was that the desire to control information suppressed information, and so even though there were technical systems in place to report up the chain, the local government suppressed information. But the big key was that the flows of information to experts and so on got stymied because Xi Jinping wanted to control the message. And so when I'm going back to what I was saying about Hu Jintao, what Hu Jintao learned about managing epidemics in China is that you need to have more channels for information and flows. And so after the SARS epidemic, there was an effort to relax controls over the media so that media could report more openly about problems at the local level, recognizing that local governments there's this principal agent problem between local governments and the central government. Xi Jinping's centralization and control over information is it's strengthening of the authoritarian political system in China is definitely has definitely been a huge source of the rapid spread of the disease, because there just wasn't enough information getting out to the local public and to the international community early enough.
Hal, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I would add that while the Chinese seem to have implemented some very harsh and effective measures in suppressing the disease after it had progressed to a very dangerous point, it's really hard for us to tell how effective that Chinese response has been, because the information that's coming out of China is so thoroughly distorted. And so my colleague Derek Scissors at AEI has done sort of some basic math, checking Chinese numbers of reported cases and deaths from coronavirus. And basically, they don't pass the laugh test. And so it's hard for us to know whether those numbers are off by a factor of 2 or by a factor of 10 or whatever. But it testifies to some of the problems that Carla was highlighting in dealing with authoritarian regimes. And I would just add that I think you can find examples of authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian systems that have performed fairly well in dealing with coronavirus. I think Singapore probably wins the prize in that respect. You can also find examples of democracies that have actually performed exceedingly well in dealing with COVID. Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Germany, even, to cite a larger country. And so neither political system seems to have a monopoly on success or failure in grappling with this disease. I tend to think that democracies, on balance, will do better over the long run because they probably have higher levels of transparency, better information sharing, and more trust in government authorities, all of which public health people will tell you are critical to getting on top of pandemics. But you can find exceptions to those rules in the current case as well.
Let's get to Carla. Let's get to the something of that people in Congress and, of course, elsewhere are very concerned about what's been going on in Hong Kong and indeed Taiwan. Um, how are recent events, the protests and the crackdown, how are they affecting U.S.-China relations? What's your perspective on that?
I think the Hong Kong crisis is one that is emerging as sort of, I don't know if it's ground zero for Sino-American tensions, but it is certainly encapsulating the many of the issues that we have working with China, partly because although we weren't directly involved in the handover, the United States has been deeply concerned about maintaining the one country, two systems commitment that China made when the British completed the handover in 1997 of Hong Kong to the mainland. And since the early 1990s, the United States U.S. Congress has required a review of the status of Hong Kong, ensuring that the one country, two systems formula has been maintained. And that formula is supposed to allow the Hong Kong Chinese to continue the way of life that existed under British rule, and also to expand democratic process in choosing local leaders, and that has not happened. And now we've had a series of efforts by China, first in extradition, an effort to through the Hong Kong government to have a extradition law that would have expanded China's ability to extradite people from Hong Kong to the mainland, as well as this national security law, which will it's very hard to know exactly how China will use it at the moment because it's only in draft form, but it would enable the Chinese government to charge people with treason and that kind of thing. It will definitely inhibit free speech. And meanwhile, the Chinese government has not enabled the expansion of direct elections in Hong Kong, as many people in Hong Kong had expected would happen. And so we have a situation where if you're looking for I think the U.S. had seen Hong Kong as kind of one step ahead, a potential beacon for the rest of China, and instead we're seeing China, increasingly centralized and authoritarian China, tightening its grip over Hong Kong and rolling back its political independence or autonomy rather, and the political freedoms inside Hong Kong. And so that sends it sort of affirms concerns about the direction of politics in China, and not to mention deep concern about the future of a city that has really been a beacon for free trade and an open society on China's periphery. And I won't get into the Taiwan issue now. Maybe I'll go back to you. We can pick that up in a moment.
Yeah, Hal. So Carl's looking at it in large measure from the Chinese perspective. What's our perspective? What are we doing? How are we responding? What responsibilities does Congress have? Let me turn it to you.
So I think the Chinese gamble in making this move now, which I assume was being prepared for some time, was that the international response would not be particularly painful, either because countries that might be in a position to respond are either economically dependent on China or are distracted by coronavirus and other things. And so far, that gamble seems to have paid off a little bit in dealing with the European Union, for instance, which has decided to go the route of kind of strongly worded letter with no substance attached to it in its relationship with China. But there has been a stronger response from the United Kingdom, so far, which has basically said we're going to create a path to citizenship for up to 3 million residents of Hong Kong. And we have at least the makings of a stronger response from the United States. And so, shortly in the aftermath of the introduction of the national security law, Secretary Pompeo said that the United States had determined that Hong Kong no longer enjoys a substantial degree of autonomy from China. And those are kind of the magic words in the way that Carla talked about, because that opens the door to a variety of measures to strip away the special status that Hong Kong has in US policy and US law. What we don't know yet is how aggressively the administration will seek to strip back that status. And so we could see everything up to basically Hong Kong's special commercial status being suspended. And so it would then be subject to all of the tariffs and all of the trade frictions that have afflicted US economic relations with the rest of mainland China. And that would presumably have a fairly significant impact on Hong Kong's status as a commercial and financial center, although how exactly it plays out, I think we're all still trying to figure out. And so that's kind of what's to be watched at the moment. How far is the administration going to go in terms of levying sanctions of one sort or another in response to this episode? And clearly, there's a significant degree of latitude for Congress here as well. And so there are a number of congressional representatives and senators who have shown a strong interest in Hong Kong issues over the years. And so I would imagine that those folks are in communication with the State Department right now, trying to shape the administration's response and may be considering responses of their own.
So are there red lines for China? And if so, what are they with respect to the West taking actions or taking positions on Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Any move by the United States to encourage independence is the big red line, and that particularly applies to Taiwan. It hasn't been something the United States has pressed for with respect to Hong Kong. We have really just asked that the Chinese uphold the basic law and the agreement, the joint declaration that the Chinese and British signed. So we have stuck to that, and rather than pushing for independence, there is an independence movement in Hong Kong, and some of our political leaders, for example, to stand next to pro-independence Hong Kong citizens. That would be that would be seen as a major policy shift by the United States, and the Chinese would take action. They would take action not so much against the United States, but against Hong Kong. And I think that's something we really have to be cautious about in our policies and recognize that the Chinese response to whether it is our decision to decertify Hong Kong as or any other actions that we will take, we have to recognize that they are going to affect the Hong Kong citizens first and foremost. And that is the same, a bigger discussion on Taiwan policy, the same with our Taiwan policy. The red line there is where the United States to champion full sovereignty, independence for Taiwan. We would see all kinds of repercussions.
Hal, where are you on the red line question?
So I'll take the Taiwan piece of it, because one of the really interesting things about COVID is that it has produced a stronger outpouring of American support, or at least admiration for Taiwan, right? Which is the democratic China that handled the crisis very, very well in an exemplary fashion. And I think it is leading to advocacy in some corners for deepening the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. I don't hear anyone saying that the United States should support a Taiwanese declaration of independence, because I think that's generally recognized that would be very destabilizing within the relationship and might actually get everybody into a situation they would prefer to avoid. But you do hear proposals to go as far even as revisiting the one China policy and perhaps extending diplomatic recognition to Taiwan which I think in Beijing's eyes would be the functional equivalent of U.S. support for a declaration of independence, or even just increasing military and diplomatic ties with Taiwan, which are pretty tightly circumscribed at the moment by the Taiwan Relations Act and a variety of policy guidelines that have put in place pursuant to that. What's interesting is there was a statement from the Chinese government about 2 or 3 weeks ago that reiterated kind of the standard boilerplate in China's approach to Taiwan, which is that China reserves the right to use force to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence or seceding, as the Chinese sometimes refer to it. But there was a twist on this one, which is that it was written in a way that implied that the Chinese might use force to prevent the current situation from going on forever, right? And so the current situation is one in which Taiwan does not enjoy legal independence, but does enjoy de facto autonomy, de facto independence, in a sense. And so what the Chinese may be signaling is that we're not willing to live with the status quo forever. We do expect that Taiwan will come back to the mainland at some point. Xi Jinping has sometimes sort of vaguely referenced 2049 as the date by which he hopes this will be accomplished. And so what you may be seeing is posturing on the Chinese side as well in an effort to try to dissuade the United States or other countries from doing more to support Taiwan. From my perspective, the really critical issue in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is enabling Taiwan to defend its independence, its de facto independence, from a PRC assault or an attempt at coercion. And there's a lot of work to be done there as well. I don't think that is a fight that Beijing would go into enthusiastically, or they would go into lightly, because it would be very challenging. And if Xi Jinping or his successor started a war over Taiwan and lost, that could be an existential threat to the regime. But I think that the danger of that is probably growing in the coming years, because the Chinese think that the military balance in the strait is becoming more favorable to them. At the same time, they worry that the political balance in Taiwan is becoming less favorable to them, as more of a distinctive Taiwanese as opposed to Chinese national identity emerges, and as Beijing-friendly politicians get left farther and farther in the dust, at least over the last decade or so. And so if you put those things together, you could have a scenario where the Chinese believe 5, 10, 15 years from now that the political window is closing while the military window is opening. And I think that would be quite dangerous.
You know, we titled this discussion about the global PR battle. And Carla, depending on how vaccine efforts develop, what will the impact be on the relations between the countries? As this is, of course, a global problem. So it potentially could have a lot of impact on how the world sees both countries.
Well, apparently there are about 90 different efforts around the world to develop a vaccine, but President Trump is urging the United States to produce one on warp speed, and we certainly have the capacity to do that. I think were we to develop a vaccine before China, for example, that would be an incredible PR win. And at that point, we ideally will not squander that by actually producing and sharing the vaccine with other countries. There are a lot of areas where we could use this to bolster our flagging influence, including in the Western Hemisphere, where we've seen the coronavirus actually serve to push countries in our own hemisphere, whether it's Mexico or Brazil, more closely into China's arms. And similarly, I think tomorrow China is meeting with a group of African nations. I think Xi Jinping himself will host them to discuss a range of different topics, but will include health. And if we are concerned about China's growing influence in that continent, playing a role there in distributing a vaccine would be an exciting opportunity, and et cetera. We would have a real opportunity to show that the United States still leads and is a source of global public goods.
But there's another side of that coin, right, Hal? potentially?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that the Chinese very much view it in the same light, and so you can think of this as a space race that actually matters, right? And so the space race of the 1960s was hugely important symbolically, but really had kind of limited impact for the quality of life of people on Earth. This one matters symbolically because it has profound implications for the quality of life of people around the world. And so I think the Chinese are certainly hoping to be the first to develop a vaccine. That would go a long way in erasing some of the reputational damage that China suffered from being the source of the virus and from mishandling the initial response. And it's been reported, certainly in the open press, that there have been hacking attempts originating from China against many of the institutions in the United States and elsewhere that are also engaged in vaccine R&D. And so I think that the Chinese very much view this as an aspect of the competition with the United States, one that is going to have a significant impact on how the legacy of the crisis plays out in this long-term competition.
Either of you can start on this, but how effective has China been as we go through the crisis and maybe even before that in exploiting the challenges the US has in its relationship with Europe?
Sure. I mean, I think it's had mixed effects. Some countries, we read, I think it was news in the New York Times. They focused on Serbia and Serbia's reaction to China's health diplomacy. There have been other countries that, like in Eastern Europe, in particular, where China has used its distribution of masks and other PPEs to those countries to show its friendship, building on its economic relationships with those countries. But I think China's strategy has backfired in many countries in the region, in Europe, who have been very concerned for a while that China was having a corrosive influence on the European Union's integrity, and that might even be an objective of China's a strategic objective associated with China's Belt and Road strategy. So when you have part of the region sending messages of appreciation and thanks to China, and part of the region, part of Europe, worrying about the source of the virus, about China's heavy-handed propaganda, promoting its superior system and so forth. It actually has enhanced tensions across Europe. I'm having trouble sort of reconciling with that some of the polling data, though, that is coming out of Europe that also shows that China's that support for China among some of the publics has remained fairly strong throughout this whole crisis relative to the United States. And I think that's something the United States really needs to repair. I think the coronavirus, this pandemic, has also highlighted that although there are opportunities for the United States to exploit because of China's mixed impacts on the European response, reaction to China's health diplomacy. There also is a problem in that the United States has also failed to support its allies during this pandemic, and so there's a lot of negative fallout from that.
Cal?
So I think that in general, the balance of European government opinion seems to have become less enamored of China since the crisis began, for reasons that Carla mentioned. But it's useful to draw the distinction between European countries and then Europe as an entity, and precisely because Beijing has been successful in cultivating countries mostly in Eastern and Southern Europe, and in finding ways of fracturing the unity of the EU on China-related issues, the EU as an entity has not moved dramatically as a result of this crisis. And this is a challenge for the United States, because I think the United States is accustomed to thinking that Europe will be on America's side in whatever the great geopolitical competition of the age is. But the Chinese have actually pursued a fairly adept strategy for weakening the cohesion of Europe and making it harder for Europe to respond as an entity. The United States, by the way, has actually done some of that itself. And so this administration has pursued a strategy that's relatively hostile to the EU. And moreover, I think that while a number of European governments are increasingly skeptical of Chinese intentions and actions, they're also just frankly worried about the reliability of the United States. And so if the ask that the United States is making is, okay, now go get tough with China, now go pick a fight with China, what we have to be able to deliver on is saying, and we will be there with you when the going gets tough. What happens now, not just in Europe, but frankly around the world, is that countries are a little bit hesitant to walk out on that limb for fear that it might be sawed off behind them.
So I'm going to hit you both with the same last question. So we'll do a little quick hitter. What do you think is the most, Hal, we'll start with you. What do you think is the most important opportunity we're missing in this challenging time with respect to our relationship to China?
So I think the most important opportunity that we've whiffed on so far is the idea that came out of the UK, basically, to expand and reform the G7 to make it a group of 10 leading democracies that would work together in developing alternatives to reliance on Chinese 5G technology in particular. This has been the big stumbling block for the United States. We go to our allies around the world and we say, don't use Huawei. And they say, okay, what's the alternative? Right? And so I think if you actually could get a partnership of, we'll call it the free world, and developing democratic 5G alternatives, that could potentially be a game changer in a competitive sense. The problem is that we have kind of got in the way of that one by proposing that Russia also be included in an expanded G7, which made it seem as though we were missing the point a bit. And so I'd like to see us pick up that idea and put our weight behind it, because I think that has a lot of promise.
So, Carla, for you, Hal just told us what he thought the most important opportunity the U.S. has missed in this challenging time with respect to its relationship to China. What's yours?
I am going to reveal my support for multilateral institutions here, and say that we have missed an opportunity to lead in globally. The United States has for many decades been the leading provider of global public goods. We founded the WHO, or we're a key founding member of the WHO. We have exercised leadership in many multilateral forums, and I think we could have used this opportunity to demonstrate our support for a collective action around a global challenge, and we have not done that. For philosophical reasons, I think, more than anything else. And I think that is a missed opportunity, because it's given enormous space for China to promote its idea of a shared future, a common future for mankind. And that may seem clumsy to us in the West, but it actually has a fair amount of traction. And we have to remember, China's audience isn't just the United States, and it's not just Western democracies, but it is the rest of the world. And that's a big world, and it's also the Chinese people. And so I think we missed an opportunity to show the world that we can still lead effectively, and the world still needs us.
Carla, Hal, we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you both for joining us here at the Library of Congress for our conversation on the Future of Democracy series, and we appreciate it. Thank you both very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.